So guys, just to introduce John to you, John Botha is a specialist in workforce strategy and transformation and planning. He's held a global executive position for a global workforce solutions provider for many years. He was a negotiator at NetLac for around 7 years and represented South Africa on the ILO and ILC in 3 occasions in Geneva. He holds a BCom honors degree and a postgraduate diploma in labor law and a certificate in design thinking from MIT in the US. John also has more than 20 years experience in employment equity consulting. And John, once again, thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and information with everybody present. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Albie. Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. I'm on the road in Pietermaritzburg, and I will be trying my best to assist you in understanding the impact of the employment equity amendments, not only on organizations in general, but specifically in the temporary employment services context. So just a word of thanks, Albie, to you and to Krista for inviting me to engage with you. I believe I've put together something that is practical, something that you can use to analyze your context and to make decisions that will drive you towards your goals and really just enhance your particular opportunities. So thank you so much. I'm going to get straight into the business of it. Colleagues, Krista will be sending you the deck. I sent it to her this last night, and Krista will be sharing it with you. So don't stress about taking notes. It's not necessary. So the storyline for today, it's in the air. Not love is in the air. It's transformation and employment equity. There's a huge amount going on in the transformation domain, BE, employment equity, codes on harassment, South Africa ratifying Convention 190 on preventing and eliminating harassment. So, colleagues, the reality is the tone has been set. How do we respond to this? Then I'm going to talk about recapping the big ticket items. So there's a huge song and dance about the Employment Equity Act amendments, but there are really only 3 or 4 big issues that you should be concerned about and decide how you're going to respond to that. Then I'm going into specifically the temporary employment services environment. I'll be going into section 57, which is often forgotten or ignored or neglected. And that can no longer be the case. I'm then going to put myself in the shoes of clients, of TESs, and I'm going to try and empathize and identify proactively things that must be on the client's minds. You know, it's not just about the fact, it's also about how people's emotions respond to these things, because decisions, colleagues, are made off the back of emotions. And if you do not regulate those emotions, you could end up making the wrong decisions as TSs and as clients. And of course, we need to ensure that we make the right decisions. We told you make 35,000 decisions a day. Let's make them count. So it's in the air, colleagues. So long story short is the Employment Equity Amendment Bill has now gone through all 18 stages at Parliament. And it literally is just waiting for the President's signature, as we know. If you want to ever follow these bills, you can go onto a website called the Parliamentary Monitoring Group. And any bill that is being tabled or is about to be tabled is on that Parliamentary Monitoring Group. So if you're trying to find out how to grow your cannabis, you're welcome to go and see how the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill is doing and when you can start, you know, focusing on your cannabis harvest. But colleagues, in seriousness, we're waiting for the President. He'll sign this off, the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, between now and the end of the year. What we also have clarity on, though, is that in the roadshow, the Department of Employment and Labour said that the date of implementation the date of implementation of the Act and hence the ministerial sectoral targets will be the 1st of September next year. So obviously they missed a beat and they've now postponed it to September next year. But don't disconnect just yet, because you're going to need every single day, week and month between now and next year to get your house in order so that you hit the road running. When I say it's in the air, of course, you've seen Department of Employment and Labour doing a national roadshow, and went to all of these provinces and towns, and they stood on the stage and they made a whole range of comments, including quite derogatory comments about certain employers who employ too many foreign nationals, as an example, and some employers who are not compliant. In fact, they say that 94% of companies, as we speak, are not compliant with employment equity based on the DG reviews. So if we're going to have an opportunity for success after these amendments are implemented, we better be sure we have a solid foundation. So, colleagues, it's all the talk. Boardrooms must be concerned about this. Excos, Mancos, supply chains, you name it. All the stakeholders are now sitting with this head full of information. Let's just talk about that information very quickly. Now, effectively, colleagues, the ministerial sectoral targets have to be the big ticket item. In other words, historically, companies could, with the consultation of their committees, companies could set their own employment equity targets, right? So they could set their own targets and the duration of their plan. That right has been partly usurped. In other words, the ministerial sectoral targets will kick in on next year, the 1st of December, 2023. So you can see that over there. That's the starting point, formally. Then you're going to have a 5-year period. As a designated employer, employing more than 50 people, you're going to have a 5-year period in which to achieve the ministerial targets that have been set for your sector or subsector. Now, just a few comments in terms of this. The first thing is you can see it's a 5-year plan. 5th year, you don't have discretion, colleagues. You can't sit and think and say, well, I wonder how many top managers I'm going to have who are African, Indian, colored, and white in the 5th year. You can't sit and determine how many senior, middle, junior managers you're going to have across the various race, gender, and disability categories. No, they have been set for you. The 5th year, set for you. Now, if you have not yet looked at your current version of the ministerial sectoral targets, I want to encourage you to go to our website, www.globalbusiness.co.za. And in that website, we have a resources portal, and you can go and take a look at the 18 sectors and the current targets, because remember, they're still under consultation. Now, if you're a temp employment service here today, you will know that you've got clients across all of these sectors and industries. You've got agri clients, mining, manufacturing, construction, finance, etc. So you would be able to go and take a look at the targets that have been set by the minister for your particular clients across the various occupational levels for the 5th year. Now, companies can set their own intervening targets. So for year 1, 2, 3, and 4, yes, you look at your business strategy, your growth, your consolidation, how many people are retiring, etc. And you can set your first 4-year targets as a designated employer. So all kinds of TESs are thinking about this right now. The point is, it will be very useful to go and take a look and see what your clients' end state would be in terms of these targets. Now, having said that, I've just pulled up the ministerial targets for manufacturing. So broadly, given manufacturing, if you've got clients in the manufacturing sector, really at top management, you'll see on the far right at the top 50% black representation at top management level, and then they break it down into African, colored, and Indian. So 43.6% African, 4.9% colored, 1.5% Indian. And then they break it down into sub-gender, male and female quantities. So there are a number of learning points here, colleagues. The first learning point, there's the hard stop in 5 years. 50% black representation at top, 60% at senior, 75% middle, 88% junior management. Now you'll say, John, that looks like the BEE management control targets. Well, you're right. Many of these have been modeled around those targets. The point, though, is you still have to plan exceptionally carefully because you need to get as close as possible to these particular sub-race and gender categories. In other words, workforce planning becomes critically important. Thanks, Connor. Workforce planning, colleagues, is now no longer a gray, warm and fuzzy. Workforce planning now becomes just like your financial managers. You go to them, you say, what's the bank balance? And they'll tell you to the last cent. Organizations are now going to have to start properly planning. How do they design their workforce? What models do they use? And then within that, how do they use recruitment, selection, training, promotion, etc., to achieve these targets? And it's within this context that collaboration is critically important. In other words, collaboration means you cannot do this on your own. You're going to have to partner with your TESs. You're going to have to partner with your outsourcing providers. You're going to have to partner with your training providers. You're going to have to have a very integrated workforce plan. Now, just to give you context, when the Department of Labor set these targets, they actually looked at the as is. Now, this is 2+ years ago, but in 2020, only 9.7% of top managers were African. And the target is 43.6%. So in 5 years, colleagues, companies are going to have to go and they're going to have to improve by some 32% in terms of top management representation. At senior management, it's from 14 to 52%. Now, you can just get a sense of the importance of this process. Now, I understand most TESs probably that you use would focus predominantly on semi-skilled, unskilled, or junior management type levels. And that's fine. But the point is they become a feeder and a very important partner, both strategically and operationally, in supporting you in achieving these particular targets. So that's the first thing. The big ticket item is the minister now sets the targets. The second definition that, or thing that's changed is definition of people with disabilities. And it's been broadened to include people with sensory impairments. In other words, if you look at the little breakdown, smell, touch, taste, spatial awareness, hearing, you see these are sensory impairments and they are now included. You can see they've been included in the definition. In other words, if someone has a long-term or recurring condition, in other words, more than 12 months, like you're hard of hearing, and it's a long-term condition, more than 12 months. The second requirement, it must be physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory. Damn sure, hearing is sensory. However, I'm not yet a person with disabilities because it actually has to limit my entry into or advancement in employment. And effectively, colleagues, it's that which is the deciding criteria. The fact that I'm hard of hearing doesn't mean that in my job at Global Business Solutions that Global have to make accommodation for me. Fortunately for now, all good. Okay, so I'm not a person with disabilities, at this particular point in time. The point I'm trying to make, colleagues, is there is a universal 2% target. In other words, as much as you've got targets across all industries, all occupational levels, you could meet all of these targets and you might think you're really good. But what you do is you just don't end up in the 5th year with 2% people with disabilities, and then you're going to be toast as well because you haven't met your people with disabilities targets. So therein again lies opportunities for collaboration and planning, and of course to get people to disclose their disabilities. You know, the codes of practice and regulations say that people are not compelled to disclose disabilities. So there's no compulsion or mandate that if you have a disability, you've got to disclose that. But what is necessary is for you to create an environment of trust where people can feel, I don't mind disclosing my disability because I know my boss is not a moron. They're not going to hold it against me and they're not going to criticize me and they're not going to prejudice me for that. I believe that organizations are going to have a lot more campaigns around disclosure of disabilities. Third and final big ticket item that I want to cover today is the certificate of compliance. Now, colleagues, every year across these 5 years, when you submit your EA 2 and 4, you will either get a certificate of compliance or you won't. When won't you get a compliance? Well, I've summarized it on the right-hand side. You won't get a certificate if you haven't achieved your targets, or you cannot provide evidence of a justifiable reason. In other words, if you set your own targets in year 1 and you miss them, well, then your only chance of getting a certificate would be to raise one of these 7 grounds where my cursor is at the bottom. So you're going to have to make a submission with evidence to say, we didn't recruit, we didn't promote, we haven't got people the right skill, we had a merger, an acquisition, a transfer, or you know what, monkeypox hit us and we couldn't make any progress. You see, that is the reality in which we're facing ourselves. Now, we can spend a lot of time unpacking this, but the point is companies are going to need a lot more evidence. In other words, if companies flew by the seats of their pants and didn't appoint designated people and didn't keep records, well, now they're going to have to change, because you would have to lead evidence and say, we had 10 vacancies, these were the applications received from these candidates, and this is why we rejected them. And if you can't lead evidence in that regard, well, then you're going to have a problem and you won't get your certificate. The next one is, obviously, you've got to submit your EA 2 and 4 between 1st of September and 15th of January every year. How's this for a really important one here? You must not have been found guilty of any form of unfair discrimination, including harassment, in the preceding 12-month period. So in other words, if one of your supervisors or managers rolled their eyes at someone or joked at their expense or made derogatory comments or excluded them or used vulgar language, and that wasn't properly addressed and it ended up at the CCMO Labour Court, colleagues, you will not get a certificate of compliance, because there's an interface between the online system and the court registers and the case management systems. So you see, colleagues, that is the reality of what we are facing. And as organizations, what it means is you're going to have to do proper induction. In your induction, you've got to cover POPI. Why? Not because I said so, but because the POPI Act says you've got to have awareness training on POPI. In your induction sessions, you're going to have to cover harassment, because you mustn't look seductively at your colleagues, right? Okay? And that's why, especially if you're on tour with a box and things, but I'll leave it at that for now. Okay. So colleagues, you know, the reality is we need to make sure people are aware of these things. And then, of course, you need to pay the national minimum wage. Okay. If you cover all of those areas, well, you will get your certificate of compliance. You might say, but John, we understand this and we understand the principle and the rationale and the philosophy, but what if we don't get a certificate? So what does it mean to us? Well, colleagues, the first thing it means is you will automatically be excluded from government and state-owned entity tenders. In other words, any revenue stream you have got or were hoping to get will dry up immediately. To the right of that, I've put in that you'd possibly also be excluded from private sector tenders. Now, the reason I put that in is, remember, there's no law that prevents private companies like Old Mutual, and private as in not list, you know, whether they list or not, I'm saying privately owned, non-government. There's nothing stopping Old Mutual or Nampak or Sasol or whoever from including in their procurement processes more onerous procurement requirements. So when they ask you for your tax compliance certificate and your B certificate, they're going to ask you for your employment equity certificate. The third one is, currently there are discussions between the BEE Council and the Employment Equity Commission. And these discussions, amongst other things, are suggesting that if you don't have a certificate of compliance, when you are verified for employment equity, for BEE rather, your management control element will not be scored. So you would potentially lose 19 points on your scorecard in the event that you do not have a certificate of compliance. And then obviously you can still have litigation under the Employment Equity Act. In other words, people can still sue you for unfair discrimination, for not complying with your targets, not implementing your plan. Now, I know it sounds like hell and damnation, but colleagues, the reality is that there are reasons underpinning this. And one of the reasons is that, quite frankly, organizations have treated employment equity as a task. And as a result of treating it purely as a tick list and a task, they have made insufficient progress. And employment equity is as much about emotional intelligence as it is about task-focused IQ. So you know, colleagues, you can have the brightest engineer, but with no interpersonal skills, and they're actually worth not a hell of a lot, okay? So we need to combine EQ with IQ, connection with task. We're going to have to, as leadership, engage clients, engage suppliers, engage employees, because you can imagine the response by stakeholders to these targets. You can imagine the response by boards of directors to these threats. And that's why we're having this webinar today, because we're saying, don't make decisions emotionally, make decisions based on reflecting on how you respond to the situation. I don't know about you, but when you sometimes get cut off in traffic and that, you want to go absolutely crazy and you get road rage. You see, the reason is because your limbic system, the old part of your brain, is fight, flight, or freeze, and stores your emotional memory. And your limbic system, that old part of your brain, processes things a lot quicker than your rational brain. That's why when people tell you just reflect before you respond, is the signal actually has to get to your rational brain, because if you just live in your emotional brain, you're not going to get anywhere. And this is an example of why it is so critical to sit back, reflect, and say, how do we build a sustainable business, notwithstanding some of these challenges? Well, colleagues, what about Section 57? Now, Section 57 of the Employment Equity Act is extremely, extremely important. And I can promise you, as far as the East is from the West, so are the variant in interpretation of Section 57. Some people just hope that it will disappear. Other people go over the top and now get too hectic and too analytic about it and end up in analysis paralysis. What we need to do is we need to look at the law and say, how do we respond to this? Now, first of all, it says in Section 57, subsection 1, it says, for purposes of Chapter 3 of this Act. So what I've done is I've extrapolated Chapter 3, the table of contents. Now, let's look at Chapter 3. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to highlight areas. First of all, Chapter 3 says affirmative action measures, which includes awareness, training, and diversity. Section 16 talks about your consultative committee, your employment equity committee, consulting, analyzing your workforce profile and your policies, drafting a plan, submitting a report and successive reports to the Department of Employment and Labor. So, colleagues, effectively, what we see in Chapter 3 is they're saying for purposes of the right-hand side, in other words, for all of these things, a person whose services have been procured for or provided to a client by a TES is deemed to be the employee of that client, where the person's employment is of infinite duration or for a period of 3 months or longer. Now, it's not about whether we agree or disagree or like this or dislike this. This is what it says. And it basically says, if you use a temporary employment service as a client, after 3 months, the client is deemed to be the employer for Chapter 3. Now, if you read it at face value, what does it mean? Well, what it means is that the client now has to include the interests of that TES assignee in this process. In other words, at the Employment Equity Committee meeting, the interests of a TES assignee should be tabled. So there should be an agenda point, for example, TES employees. because someone's got to account and consider their particular context. When it comes to Section 21, when the client has to report at the end of the year to the Department of Labor on the workforce profile, well, then after 3 months, these employees are deemed to be employees of the client. So now the whole question is, who reports on whom? So let's unpack this. Given Section 57, a temporary employment service will have a head count. Let's call it, 1,000 people. And at a point in time, that 1,000 people will be comprised of people who've been on their client site for less than 3 months, and those who've been on indefinitely or for more than 3 months. And effectively, Section 57 is saying, at that cut-off date, when you report to the Department of Employment and Labor and you gather the stats, less than 3 months must be the TES's responsibility, and the more than 3 months must be the client's responsibility, because that's effectively what Section 57 just told us. Now, as Albie shared with you, colleagues, I've been privileged to work in the TES industry for more than 2 decades. In fact, it's going on for 3. And it's the most wonderful industry because it has so many advantages. And it has so many touch points that can underpin the strategies of their clients. And this is another one. It must not be seen in a negative sense. It's time to sit down and collaborate and to say, how do we address this in your environment, client? How can we use this to assist you in achieving your targets? So colleagues, effectively, more than 3 months, clients should be reporting on them. Less than 3 months, TES. Now, I know I'm dumbing it down, but effectively, effectively, that's what it is. Now, Reggie, your question is so good. I was actually preparing for today and I thought I must raise this, but you beat me to it. Reggie, the earning threshold does not feature in employment equity from this point of view. So you're absolutely spot on. For the Labour Relations Act, there's an earnings threshold of 224,000 Rand per annum. And if people earn below that, the deeming provision kicks in, etc. But for employment equity, you'll notice, Reggie, over here, for employment equity, they haven't limited this Section 57 to earnings thresholds. So whether you are a temporary employment service assignee who earns 1,000 Rand an hour, or whether you are a temporary employee through a TES that earns the national minimum wage, 23 Rand, whatever an hour, it doesn't matter. After 3 months, the client should be reporting on these individuals. So good question. In other words, what does it mean? It means that come the 1st of September, through to January the 15th, the client reports on the more than 3 months temporary employees here. And I say here because not over there. Here means here and not there. A lot of people say, no, they're temporary employees. No, they're not temporary employees. A temporary employee is defined in the Employment Equity Act as someone who works less than 3 months. Your temporary assignees are working by definition more than 3 months when the client reports on them. So to the question or the chat box issue from Reggie, the reality is if you've placed an IT analyst or systems analyst at a client, and that systems analyst is at a senior management position, the client should be reporting on your temporary employee on their above-the-line workforce analysis. Again, let me explain why they don't go under temporary employees, as logic would tell you. The reason is a temporary employee, if you look at the EA 2 and 4, is defined as someone who works less than 3 months. Now, Dorcas, I knew you were going to ask that question. What about learnerships, internships, apprenticeships, and all those other ships that we have? Well, the reality is they are for 12-month periods, even yes for youth. 12-month periods. 12 months is longer than 3 months, colleagues. 12 months is 12 months, which is longer than 3 months in Section 57. And please also note they don't say that Section 57 excludes learners, excludes apprenticeships, excludes Yes for Youth. No, colleagues, 12 months is 12 months. Very good question, Dorcas. Thank you for that. So, colleagues, I'm giving you what the law says, okay? This is not my view. It's not my interpretation. It's as clear as daylight. Now, where does the TES feature? The TES then would report, along with its permanent staff, the TES reports on the less than 3-month assignees in the temporary employee line. Okay? Is this happening in practice is the big question. Well, the big answer is a resounding sometimes. Mostly not. Mostly not. And we're just very fortunate that labor inspectors don't pick up and say, you know, show me this. But nevertheless, that's for discussion for a different day. Of course, the same principle applies to the EA4. So it's not just about headcount and African, Indian, colored, white, male, and female, and people with disabilities. It also, the principle extends to the EA4. So in other words, your remuneration, your fixed and variable pay for TES assignees must also be appropriated into the more or less than 3 months bucket and then reported on. So that when the client does the assessment, they can pick up if there are differentials in income that need to be addressed. So colleagues, I hope that that is clear. I hope that it is making sense, and we can maybe unpack it in a bit more detail during our Q&A session. So let's empathize with clients of TES, or in fact, let's not even just empathize with clients, let's empathize with TESs. And to empathize, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. We need to say, what are they saying, thinking, doing, and feeling? Because at the end of the day, organizations want a certificate of compliance. They want to be told, well done, good and faithful servant. Here's your certificate. You can go and tender. You can go and apply for licenses. You can, you won't face litigation, etc. So if I empathized with clients, what would I be thinking? The first thing I'd be thinking as a client is workforce design. Colleagues, and I want to emphasize this, there are only two ways to give yourself a chance of meeting these targets. And as we saw, there's sometimes a massive, massive gap between where we're at and where we need to be. So there are only two ways in my mind in meeting these targets. The one is you change the design of your workforce. And the other one is you become a lot more effective in your employment life cycle. So the one is more of a strategy and a design. And the other one is more of a, now we better recruit properly, select properly, train properly, promote, career and succession plan properly. So let me talk about workforce design. You know, colleagues, it's not just because of the Employment Equity Act that I'm raising this. I mean, you've got to be really, really stuck in the third industrial revolution if you still have all your employees on your own payroll. And I say it with the utmost of respect. We have got too much of a volatile environment that needs flexible responses. That's why 2 million people lost their jobs in the first 6 months of COVID, because companies' workforce design was terrible. We need companies that have highly responsive models at low risk to them. And this is becoming more and more and more important because we've got POPI, PIA, cybercrimes. We've got PAPUDA. We've got amendments to the Equity Act. We've got amendments to amendments that are coming through. Workmen's compensation is under review as well. Health and Safety Act's under review. Companies' risk is just growing and growing. So we need to look at how do we retain responsiveness at the lowest possible risk. And it's not by employing 100% of your people on your own payroll. So when we talk about workforce design, you need to decide how I define, or how do I make a decision of who should be on my payroll? Because more and more companies, as we've seen since the 90s, have moved on to procurement-based talent acquisition through TESs. In other words, you get an invoice rather than a payroll. So you get an invoice for 1,000 staff through a TES. You get an invoice from subcontracting and outsourcing. You're paying for outputs over there. You then need some marketing or sales done. You go into Fiverr, or you go into Upwork or Elance, and you get someone sitting in China who's the best in the world in designing your website. You look at automation. The point I'm making is the gray circle is your flexible, low-risk circle. You're either jointly liable in some instances, or the TS is liable, or the RC is liable, so your liability is low. And as a company, you receive an invoice for that, which means that if it's a transformed business, it drives your procurement, it underpins a lot of your transformation and your cash flow. The cost of money of a TES running the payroll is massive, and you're benefiting from that because you're paying them on debtors' days of 30, 40, 50. But when I talk about blended workforce design, instead of having 1,000 employees on your payroll where it attracts, everything's now a percentage of payroll or headcount. People with disabilities is a percentage of headcount. Learnership's a percentage of headcount. Yes for Youth, a percentage of headcount. Everything's a percentage of headcount or a percentage of payroll. You've got to be stark raving crazy to have 100% of people on your payroll. You do need permanent people on your payroll because they're your institutional core. They're the culture of your business. They're the institutional memory, and you do need it, but you need to diversify. So when I talk about workforce design, colleagues, what I'm saying is organizations really need to sit and think about how they can go and design a workforce model that is responsive, agile, cost-effective, low risk, and which will make meeting their employment equity targets more manageable. The second one is integration into the employment life cycle. In other words, what I'm talking about here is companies are going to have to be extremely specific in terms of the next 5 years when they look at staff turnover, retirements, business growth, skill set changes, because it's those variables that will determine how companies get from 9.7 to 43%. Junior management, 49, almost 50% to 77% African. And this is where temporary employment services play such a wonderful role because they are feeders into these structures. They complement these structures. And you can have a very strategic relationship in order to drive that particular process and to feed into it. So when we talk about clients, what's going through their minds is they saying labor law has just become an exact science because we now need to plan right down to the last dot on this particular spectrum. In other words, we need to know when there's a recruitment opportunity, we mustn't be caught with our pants down, because we need to have someone in the pipelines who can fill that job. When there's a promotion opportunity, when there's training opportunities. And no wonder career and succession planning is traditionally one of the worst performing areas of companies. We then go on to statistics and reporting. In other words, you need to understand what the lay of the land is. You need to partner with TSs, and TSs need to partner with clients who understand what I've been going through, who have got the systems and the policies and the procedures to ensure that the client is not caught wanting in terms of reporting. And maybe I must just say, one of the things you're going to find is because companies and TESs have not been doing the split of reporting pre and post 3 months, what's going to happen is you're going to have a change management process, because if the Department of Labor suddenly get different stats and they can't reconcile them, they're going to be asking questions. So you may have to manage that change systematically. Of course, as I said, from a BE point of view, the use of TES's procurement rather than payroll is a huge item. It's a huge procurement item. And also it feeds into disabilities. It feeds into your entry-level positions. And then finally, colleagues, if I was thinking about this, what comes to mind is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So not only is it a legal requirement, but you need to look at advocacy and awareness training, and you need to ensure your line managers lead and manage with emotional intelligence. You see, colleagues, we're entering into a phase where there is zero tolerance in terms of harassment. There's zero tolerance in terms of unfair discrimination. And now what you have is you have line managers who are interacting with these dynamics and interacting with people. And unfortunately, EQ is not always part of the package. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that some people, by their very nature, the way that they've been designed, are critical. So some people, by their very nature, are critical, what we call critical parents. So you know when little Johnny comes home with a bad school report, you know, he goes to maybe his mother, and she says, Johnny, don't worry, you know, we'll send you for extra maths lessons. Next year's a new year. We with you, we love you, you know, we'll support you. That's called a nurturing parent, you know, so the parent who nurtures, and little Johnny must enjoy his holiday. And then the dad gets home, maybe, if you want to stereotype, later that evening, and the dad says, you got a what? You got an E average, and uses the F word, and he takes little Johnny's bicycle away, and he tells Johnny he's not going to have a holiday because he's going to do 2 hours of extra maths lessons every day. That's called a critical parent. Now, the point is parents care for their kids. There's some show it critically and others are more nurturing. So it's not necessarily right or wrong. Now, the problem is you all know people in your businesses. You all know line managers who might be extremely critical or who might be extremely nurturing. And they've all got their strengths and they've all got their weaknesses. The point I'm making is if that people do not have the ability to self-regulate and understand how they present themselves, then, colleagues, we're going to have an organization that ticks all the boxes, but who doesn't actually get anywhere. We need people with growth mindsets, people that say, right, we've got this deck of cards. How are we going to now design our future? And not just around employment equity, as I said, around disruption in general, colleagues. Disruption in general. What are you going to do when you're hit by the next cybercrime and you can't operate your business because you've been hacked? What are you going to tell your 100% full-time employees? Or can you turn the tap on and off and have a business that's sustainable? So, colleagues, that effectively is what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to cover, to recap, the fact that we cannot kick the can down the road and say to ourselves, well, you know, September next year, we'll deal with it when we get there. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of organizational culture, strategy, and operational. And there's huge opportunity here, massive. The second thing I wanted to cover is the 3 big ticket items. The first one is the ministerial targets. And as I said, you can get them on our website under resources, and you can see the 18 sectors, and you can go and download the targets and start seeing how you're going to help your clients meet their targets. The second big ticket item is the issue of the definition of people with disabilities. And then the third one was the issue in respect of the code of good practice, the code of competence, or the certificate of competence. So if you don't have your certificate of competence, well, then you're going to have various challenges. So I would rather be part of my client's decision-making processes in this 12-month period building up to September rather than hanging back and hoping for the best. Section 57, you're going to have to get stuck into Section 57 and look at a change management process to make sure that you and your clients are reporting accurately in terms of employment equity. Then we need to empathize with our clients and say, how can we help you? How might we assist you in achieving your targets? And, you know, just like we've had huge disruptors, we have an opportunity here as an industry to also be disruptive and to show clients what we can really do for them off the back of the other benefits we're already providing. And then finally, colleagues, is to have emotional intelligence. Because even a comment, a joke at someone's expense, humiliating someone, looking seductively at your colleagues, I know we joke about it, but the reality, colleagues, a CCMA or labor court decision can fundamentally result in for 12 months not getting a certificate of compliance. Now, maybe just a parting comment, you're most welcome then to post questions or to ask questions. But let's go to Section 57. I just want to share something else with you because I focused on Section 57, subsection 1. Let's not forget about Section 57, subsection 2, where a temporary employment service on the express or implied instructions of a client commits an act of unfair discrimination. Both the TES and the client are jointly and severally liable. You see, colleagues, one of the ways to eliminate any liability, whether it's joint or several, is to make sure that you've got policies, procedures, induction processes, where you tell your staff what your values are, what their obligations are, and how to treat those around them. And that's another area for collaboration between your client and yourself. You sit down, you say, how do we create this awareness? Because we don't want workforces that fundamentally are not working together in a spirit of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So LB and Krista, maybe a future webinar we can do is maybe on EQ, maybe on various aspects of diversity. But for today, colleagues, that is the issue that I wanted to cover. I hope it was useful. LB, I'm going to hand back to you. I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you. John, I see there is one question. Janine Slavers, she says, does GBS have a toolkit we can use to assist us in creating? Sorry, it just disappeared now. Obviously, I'm a slow reader. Us creating awareness in the workplace regarding harassment and discrimination.
LB, yes, we definitely can assist. I know this is not a marketing platform, but I mean, absolutely. The issue here, and I didn't want to necessarily go into it, but colleagues, millennials are going to comprise 75% of our workforce in the next 3-4 years. And research shows that millennials, for example, are twice more likely to, for example, identify as LGBTQIA+. So you need to ensure that you have an organization that is inclusive, from facilities, toilet facilities, bathroom, even your policies. You know, policies are, you know, LB must attend to his performance objectives, his or her. You know, we got to start looking at pronouns. Employees must achieve their objectives. Not good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You know, even your footers on your email signatures need to start looking and saying, well, this is how you refer to me. So absolutely, we can assist you with that. And as I said, maybe LB and Krista, we can do a session on that. There's another question, LB, or two. Let's see what Reggie's on the ball there.
Reggie's he's cooking with gas. So he says the certificate of compliance, how important is the deviation process and the role of the Section 24 manager? And with that, Section 57 does it mean the TS must be included in the EE plan? How would that impact the MC verification to prove as proof of employment with primary employer must be proven?
So the deviation, absolutely, Reggie, I mean, the deviation process is critical here, because you're now going to have to disclose why things have changed in terms of mergers, transfers, the list. So Reggie, that's the change management process I was referring to, because if historically companies had not been reporting accordingly, there's going to have to be some form of justification and around deviations. What's also interesting now is how it interacts with EE, and that's Reggie's second question. Must the TES be included in the employment equity plan? And the answer is absolutely. If you look at the slide on the screen, Reggie, section 20, the employment equity plan. So effectively, clients' employment equity plan should have a section called temporary employment services, and that TES plan should be unpacking how TES assignees of more than 3 months are going to be integrated. While I'm talking, I'm also just thinking about the LRA, section 198, capital A and capital D actually says that below the threshold, TES assignees should have access to vacancy opportunities and training. So you're definitely going to have to cover the TES angle in your employment equity plan. And it's a wonderful opportunity, as I said. Don't see it as a negative. See it as an opportunity to collaborate. Wabish says, has the department published annual turnover threshold for various sectors? Wabish, good news or bad news, I don't know how you want to see this. From September next year, the turnover threshold falls away. Okay, so from September next year, the only determining factor, if you're a designated employer, is employing 50 or more people. Okay, the turnover threshold is going to fall away next year. So currently, if you employ less than 50, but your turnover is above a certain threshold, you still have to report. That will fall away next year. Shoba says, what happens when the 3 months temps reported as permanent earn more? Because that creates salary gaps. Well, that's the point, Shoba, absolutely. So sometimes TES assignees earn more. Very seldom, I think, or they should earn the same, if you look at equal treatment or equal pay. But sometimes your more than 3 months temps earn more for various reasons. It might be skills, it might be experience and those things, but sometimes it's because they don't have pension, medical aid, and other benefits. So if it's because of a justifiable reason, Shoba, then there's no worries, because Albi's earning more than John. Why? Because he's a contractor and he doesn't have a pension fund. That's fine. But if you can't base it on something, well, then again, you're going to have to deal with that. Okay. So, colleagues,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just ending off.
Just to add to this, I mean, that diagram that you showed in terms of the flexibility and actually the slide that you've got on your on the screen in terms of the sections and the joint and several liability. It's very important that not all of the participants here are TESs, but they're clients as well. I think it's very important that clients understand that having a strategy with a TES allows you the low risk, high responsive models in your business. But you need to understand what the compliance issues are with in terms of your the TES that you use. So, if you just go and look at the joint several liability over various pieces of legislation, it's important that people also pick their partners properly. And I think in terms of the TESD, that is something that we've been promoting since 1994. And we've been actively canvassing for this flexibility to be allowed within our businesses. Our TES businesses, but also the businesses of our clients. So, it's pretty important that clients understand who they're working with and what sort of compliance issues their partners go through. It's like anything in your procurement that you have to look at. And to speak to that, if there's any of the members here that wants to find out more about what compliance means, how the TESD does that, you're more than welcome to make contact with Krista, and we can set up a discussion with them. And it's something that we've been promoting, and we are one of the few, if not the only, organization or association, although we sit under the CIFSA fold, that has actively promoted the TES to be a compliant TES that goes through various checks and balances to ensure that there is a sense of security with the client and ourselves, where we hold each other responsible, but we work together as a unit to achieve the business goals of both parties.
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important who you partner with. You can see joint liability. You know, if a client is attached to an unfair discrimination claim and they're found guilty in the labor court, that client also loses a certificate for 12 months. So this calls for collaboration, it calls for partnership, and stronger together. Excellent. Albie, over to you. Thanks to all the colleagues from my side, from Pietermaritzburg. I'm here in my old neck of the woods in KZN, and it's been an absolute pleasure, Albie, you and Krista, and with all the colleagues, and look forward to our next session. Thank you.
100%, John, and thanks again for your sage advice and insights into these things. It really makes you think, and you know, from your perspective, or from the perspective of industry, what solutions are out there for clients to meet their objectives as well. Is there any other questions from the floor around the TSD, or would you guys like to liaise with Krista?
I think I'll be limited to liaising with Krista.
100%. Right, then if there are no more questions, I bid you all a very good day. I hope you're not too stressed after the session, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not the train coming.